faithful in keeping the Sabbath then than Israel was for most of their history. But what we learn is they almost never kept it. Like they never kept the Passover. But that's something to remember as we read through the law. Remember that Israel does almost none of this. All of these things that are commanded, Israel ignores almost all of it for almost their entire history. It's pretty bad. Cindy? Oh, yeah. They throw that out the window immediately. Yeah. Yep. Pretty much every story that you read in the Old Testament is a violation of one of these commandments in one way or another. Try it sometime and see. If you're reading a story in the Old Testament, you are probably going to read a violation of one of these commandments. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. No. Yeah. Yep. That is the truth. All right. So, like I said, we'll come to these individually and get into more detail as we study the relevant laws in the law portion. But I just wanted you to see how the whole law fits together and what it's aimed towards. It is aimed towards both of these things, a proper relationship with God and a proper relationship with your neighbor. That's the whole law right there, in a nutshell. Like Jesus says, you shall love the Lord your God and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. All right, any other questions or comments on the Ten Commandments before we continue on? All right. So we're at chapter 6 now. Yeah. Excuse me. Uh-huh. I don't think there necessarily is a difference. It's a point of Hebrew style to repeat the same thing several times over using different words. Yeah, there's not really a difference between commandment, statute, and rule. Not that I'm aware of in the law of Moses. It's a way of focusing the mind on what's important about the law, right? Like you've really got to be careful about what is commanded, what the Lord tells you. That's what you're supposed to be focused on. So. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. In practice, well, think of it this way. So, when you look at some of these laws, some of them do not get very specific, right? Some of them, especially with the Ten Commandments, you can see that it's a lot of it is very broad, like you shall not murder. Well, what makes a murder, right? And that's where rabbinic tradition comes from, right? Is in trying to define the particulars of the law. And so they use something that's very similar to kind of like our command, example, necessary, inference sort of thing. They try to apply a hermeneutical logic to interpreting the law of Moses and being able to figure out exactly what's what. So like, for example, observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy. You shall not do any work. What's work? Define work. And that was basically the rabbi's job, defining work. Well, it means this, right? You can walk this distance without breaking the Sabbath, but you walk any further, and that's work, and you're breaking the Sabbath, right? Now, what's more important? the commandment or the rabbinic teaching. I mean, ultimately, the commandment is, and sometimes in the way that we interpret Scripture, especially when it comes to necessary inference, we want to slap that label necessary on things that aren't necessarily necessary. And so if you find people treating that like it may be less important, I think what they're trying to say is our interpretation of the Scripture possesses a lower rank of authority than the Scripture itself. So, good question. It doesn't amount to any sort of significant difference between the words commandment, statute, and rule. Yeah, that's just Moses saying the same thing 3 different ways. Yeah, a command, example, and necessary inference. Right, so those are 3 different hermeneutical tools that we use to interpret the Scriptures. Moses is not saying command, example, and necessary inference when he says commandments, statutes, and rules. Right? He's saying the same thing 3 times over. So in other words, you don't, command, example, necessary inference is our best way of interpreting the Scriptures. Can anyone find me the passage that says command, example, and necessary inference? No. I mean, but it's something that in the way that the Scripture interprets itself, you can find those principles in action. You don't find them explicitly named like that, though. Right, yeah. Yeah, there are examples in the Scripture. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Right, and that's, yeah, in our own system, the difference is what body came up with those rules. Yeah, like the laws are enacted by a legislative body and signed by the executive, whereas ordinances or statutes might be developed by just an administrative body, what we call administrative law. Moses is not talking about that. Yeah, he's not talking about, here's the stuff enacted by Congress versus the stuff that is enacted by an office in the executive branch, like administrative law. No, he's not talking about a distinction like that. Yeah. In short, Moses is saying, listen to God. That is what he's saying. Yeah. Okay, so Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 1. And technically, we should have read these first 3 verses, I think, with the end of chapter 5. Now this is the commandment, the statutes and the rules, that the Lord your God commanded me to teach you, that you may do them in the land to which you are going over, to possess it, that you may fear the Lord your God, you and your son and your son's son, by keeping all his statutes and his commandments, which I command you, all the days of your life, and that your days may be long. Hear therefore, O Israel, and be careful to do them, that it may go well with you, and that you may multiply greatly as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised you, in a land flowing with milk and honey. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and of your gates. All right. This is, by the way, it's little coincidence that we find this so close to the Ten Commandments. This great command that Jesus tells us is the greatest command. This is almost like this is a summary. All right, everything hinges on this. Love the Lord your God. But you'll notice the way that Moses almost holds these things in parallel. Right? How did he begin his presentation of the Ten Commandments in chapter 5? In verse 1, he says, "Hear, O Israel." And now he does exactly the same thing in chapter 6, verse 4. "Hear, O Israel. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might." All right. We're here in the final minutes. I'm not going to write all of this up on the board. But the commandment, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. What does that mean? That the Lord is one. I mean, it's kind of important. Everything hinges off of this, right? We got to get this right. Yeah, and that's part of where the mystery of the Trinity. Well, it's why it's a mystery, right? That's where it gets confusing. Is how many gods do we worship? One, right? How many persons is he? 3, but he's still one, right? Still one God. So that is one possible meaning. The Lord is one, meaning that the God that Israel worships is not many gods, but is one God. The translation is honestly kind of difficult here. You could translate this a few different ways. There's the way that we've got rendered in the ESV, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Even there, that's thrown in an extra is. If you've got one of those Bibles that italicizes extra words that are added into the translation to make sense of it in English, is should be in italics. What it says, if we wanted to give it like a really wooden sense of what it says in English, it would say, Lord, our God, and our God in Hebrew is one word. Lord, one. And that's what it says. Now, our translation has put in an is here. The Lord is one. We could put one in here as well. The Lord is our God. Because of the way Hebrew verbs work, an is could be intended there. That's why the is has been put in here. The word for one can also mean alone or only. Right? Some of you have a Bible that says that in the footnote. But the sense of this is exclusivity. Right? There's no other God for Israel other than the Lord. Right? Lord here being God's proper name, Adonai, the one that cannot be pronounced. He is the only God for Israel. There's no other God other than him. And he's not, we can interpret this as he's not made up of many gods, because that's also true. Right? Israel only has one God, unlike, say Egypt. How many gods does Egypt have? A bazillion, right? You run out of fingers and toes. How many gods do the Canaanites have? Again, they've got gods for every hill. They've got gods for every river. They've got, gods for the stars. They've got gods for the moon. They've got gods for the sun. They've got all kinds of gods. Israel is not that way. Israel has one God and one alone. And that God you love with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And your love of God is to be so complete, Moses says, that these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand. They shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Right, this is supposed to be, and by the way, most of what Moses is going to say from this point through the end of chapter 11 is going to come back to this set of instructions. That you proclaim them to your children, that you have them on your heart all the time. It's all going to come down to this. Everything that Moses has to say after this in this discourse. So we'll start with this on Sunday because there's a lot more that we can say. Any final questions or comments before we close it up? Wayne, one last one. Yeah, the part of the promise is that the new covenant is going to be put on the heart. Yeah. They didn't do what they were supposed to do. Yes. Remember, there is ultimately, because that's something that's brought up in the New Testament as being fulfilled in Jesus, right? That's fulfilled on the day of Pentecost, that promise that's made through Jeremiah. And what we see is not a distinction between the law and what Jesus has come to fulfill, but a continuity, right? Israel did not keep it on their heart like they were supposed to. Jesus has come to fix that. All right, thank you so much for your kind attention and your questions and comments this evening.